A lot of events take place on and around FF7's iconic airship, but there's generally only one sequence fans are referring to when they talk about the Highwind scene. In addition to forming a crucial story beat, this scene has become a nexus for heated discussion about Cloud's competing love interests, Aerith and Tifa. In its final implementation, the event features a few instances of branching dialogue that correspond to the player's affection points with Tifa. If this value is greater than or equal to 50, the sequence will play out more intimately, and Tifa will react differently once back on the ship. Players have felled forests dissecting the Highwind scene and debating which version is true to the game's canon scenario. But the fuss around this late-game sequence isn't exclusive to FF7's fans. Creator commentary and scrap dialogue from the game's files indicate a great deal of wavering both early in planning and late in development. In 2007, 3 of FF7's lead staff members sat down to conduct an interview for Studio Bent Stuff's 10th anniversary Ultimania. During a discussion of memorable scenes, the devs got to talking about Cloud and Tifa's night under the Highwind. Here, it's revealed that the initial premise was more risque than what's shown in the final game. I think the part that left the biggest impression on me was the scene where Tifa goes into Cloud's psychic world and helps him remember what really happened in the past. I think it was Kato who did the event for that part. That event by the airship on the night before the final showdown was Kato's work as well, right? Oh, you mean the part with the racy line? Yeah, Kato was also the one who wrote that, not me. Words aren't the only way to tell someone how you feel. That line, right? That was a pretty mature conversation by Final Fantasy standards. But I remember there being something too explicit that had to be toned down. The initial idea was even more extreme. The plan was to have Cloud exit the airship's choco pen and then have Tifa emerge after him while looking around, though of course Kitase axed that. But as for the line in question, I'm pretty sure no one thought it was a big deal at the time. In 1999, Kato gave an interview of his own with composer Yasunori Mitsuda's official fan site. There, he stated that he was suddenly and urgently called in to help with FF7's event scenes, which he was allowed to write to his personal tastes. FF7, the village where Cloud becomes a vegetable, when he falls into the live stream, the episode of Cloud and Tifa on the dawn before the final battle, on all of those I wrote them to my own personal tastes. Maybe I should learn to listen more to what other people tell me. While Kato was responsible for implementing the first part of the Highwind scene, Nojima is credited for the events that play out once Cloud and Tifa get back on board the ship. And it's here that we find some very interesting unused dialogue in the game's text files. In order to understand what's going on though, we first need to look at the organization of the Highwind's field maps. The event in question plays out in 2 locations aboard the ship, the Central Corridor and the bridge. But here's where things get complicated. While the Central Corridor map only has one major iteration, called FFVII in the game's files, the bridge map has 5. Let's go through them real quick. FFVII is the initial version of the bridge map. Despite this, it's only used in the final game when Cloud and Tifa return to the Highwind after their night on the hill. It's also home to an unused scene where Cait Sith explains the nature of Sephiroth copies and what happened to Cloud, but that's a story for another time. FFVII-2 is an alternate version of the map used when Rufus and Shinra's top brass are shown approaching the northern cavity. FFVII-3 is the version of the bridge used when Tifa or Cid is the active party leader. FFVII-4 is used briefly during the scene where Cait Sith's true identity is revealed when he mixes up his accents, and where the party learns that Hojo has hijacked the Sister Ray to help Sephiroth. Finally, FFVII-5 is the version of the bridge used at all other times when Cloud is the active party leader. As it turns out, both FFVII-4 and FFVII-5 include scrap dialogue that would have been used during the Highwind scene. Let's start with FFVII-4. Ordinarily, Tifa remarks about the Highwind feeling empty with only her and Cloud aboard. Cloud then reassures her, saying he'll make a big enough ruckus for everyone, and that Tifa won't have time to feel lonely with him piloting the airship. However, left over in this field's data appears to be an alternate version of this conversation. In it, Tifa laments that the other party members decided not to come back. Cloud responds that there's nothing the two can do. Returning was everyone's choice to make. Tifa then asks what Cloud's going to do, and he tells her, somewhat self-deprecatingly, that he plans to go through with their final mission. Tifa has a vulnerable moment thereafter and utters a line you might recognize from later in the game. Only here, it's not optional, and players don't have the opportunity to choose Cloud's response. Moreover, as you can see, the scripting for Cloud and Tifa's motions is much less dynamic, though this isn't uncommon for scrapped scenes. The scrapped dialogue then ends rather abruptly. Whether it would have led into some portion of the final version of the central corridor scene is impossible to determine from what remains in the game's files. But it's safe to say Cloud and Tifa would have eventually proceeded upstairs to the bridge. At this point in the retail release, players are taken to FFVII, where Cloud and Tifa reunite with Barret, Cid, and Red 13. This map contains a single instance of branching dialogue based on affection, where Tifa will either tap her foot or collapse in embarrassment upon learning the others observed her with Cloud. However, if we turn our attention to FFVII, we'll find a slightly different version of this scene as well. Here, after Tifa asks why the other party members didn't call down to her and Cloud, Red 13 explains that it seemed like the pair had a nice atmosphere going, and Cid says Cloud's backside made it clear he should mind his own business. These comments are a little more suggestive than their vague counterparts in the final version of the scene, where Cid merely tells Red not to stick his nose where it doesn't belong. From here, the scene proceeds similarly to the version on FFVII, though in a much more Spartan form. Notably missing are Barret's remarks about Marlene, as well as any mention of Aerith and unleashing her last wish. Instead, we unceremoniously proceed straight to Cloud's command to depart for the Northern Cavity, and, presumably, the end of Disc 2. Unfortunately, because these scrapped lines weren't used in the final version of the game, there's little code left over to show exactly how they would have been implemented. And so, we're left with a bit of a mystery. Given the presence of branching dialogue in the final version of the Highwind scene, one might be tempted to conclude these scrapped lines would trigger based on the player's affection points. However, this is almost certainly not the case. When a scene in FF7 features branching dialogue based on previous decisions made by the player, the lines in question are always stored on the same map. We can see an example of this right on FFVII, where Tifa's two responses are located directly next to one another. While it's true that this explanation could apply to the central corridor conversation on FFVII, a few factors make it unlikely. First, the scrapped lines don't seg naturally from the previous scene on the hilltop, where Cloud and Tifa already came to terms with being on their own. Second, as previously mentioned, these unused lines contain an exchange that's repeated in optional dialogue on Disc 3. This suggests that at some point, Nojima rewrote the conversation and decided to salvage part of the earlier version by injecting it later in the scenario. We mentioned before that event planner Masato Kato was responsible for handling the scenes on the hill beneath the Highwind. While FF7's maps have no internal timestamps for when they were completed, there actually is a way we can roughly determine when Kato wrote this scene. FF7's maps are organized in a giant array that governs how each field links to another. This array includes a total of 780 maps in the original Japanese version of the game, and the first 769 of them adhere to a certain degree of order. The outline for this array roughly follows the events of the game's plot, and was likely established early in FF7's development before the scenes that take place on them were implemented by the game's event planners. In almost all cases, the staff were able to adhere to the initial blueprint. However, in a handful of situations, 11 to be exact, event planners required new maps to be made. Because of the nature of the array, these extra maps couldn't simply be inserted next to their fellow fields. This is because each field includes pointers used to transport the player to other areas. Adding new entries between the existing maps would offset these pointers and break map transitions across the entire game. Therefore, these additional fields instead had to be appended to the end of the list. One of these late addition maps is Hill 2, the screen where Cloud and Tifa wake up after their night under the Highwind. The initial hill map where the first half of the Highwind scene takes place is located, fittingly, right beneath the Highwind maps near the front of the array, and was presumably placed there early on in development. Based on the position of Hill 2, however, we can determine that Kato must have implemented his scenes quite late in FF7's dev cycle. Once he did so, Nojima would have had to reassess the events he initially implemented on FFVII and FFVII. In the case of FFVII, he merely orphaned the earlier version of the corridor conversation in favor of the new one to better maintain continuity between the scenes. Which begs the question, why didn't he do the same on FFVII? Why did he instead write a whole new version of the scene on FFVII? Well, there's an answer to that. Every map in FF7 can hold a maximum of 16 character models, and each of these character models can call up to 33 scripts. These scripts manage things like movement, animation, and drawing dialogue windows. Looking at the data in FFVII's version of the sequence, we can see Cloud's character model never calls his dialogue. This is because all 33 available scripts are already in use during other events that take place on the field. In other words, there wasn't any room left on FFVII to script the end of the Highwind scene. This means that if and when Nojima rewrote the scene on the bridge, he would have had to use a different map with more free memory. And we have a very good indication that this is exactly what happened. Remember how we said there are 5 iterations of the Highwind Bridge map? Well, that was a bit of a lie. There are actually 6. A new version of the map was created much later in development, FFVII-6. It can be found at the end of the map list array, just a handful of slots after Hill 2 in fact. The only problem is, this map is empty. It's just a vacant slot in the array with no associated data. Strange, right? Well, here's what most likely happened. When Nojima realized FFVII didn't have enough space to rewrite his scene, he requested a brand new version of the map to be made. However, at some point, he realized this wasn't necessary. FFVII, the aforementioned initial version of the bridge map, still had plenty of memory left. All that seems to have existed on it up to that point was a bit of debug scripting that took players to the world map. And so Nojima went ahead and rewrote the end of the Highwind scene on FFVII instead. Because it isn't packed with talk to lines for when Cloud is party leader, Nojima was able to expand the scene significantly. Moreover, Nojima probably saw how Kato made use of the affection system on the hill beneath the Highwind and decided to do so himself. Unlike FFVII, which has no branching dialogue, FFVII has Tifa react differently to match what transpired on the hill map. In the end, much of this is mere speculation. No matter how much we dig into the data, it's impossible to draw a definitive conclusion about when, why, and how these scenes were altered. So why go to all the trouble of investigating it? One reason is that we're just compulsive like that. No mystery is not worth digging into. But it's also a great reminder of the many talents that went into creating FF7, and the sort of non-linear, chaotic development that, against all odds, birthed a masterpiece. The scene's multiple reworkings, from a raunchy romp in the Choco Pen, to suggestive comments from Red and Sid, to a more ambiguous episode with alternate outcomes, reveal an interesting effort to reflect the game's affection system in how its scenario unfolds. As Tetsuya Nomura once said, FF7 was lovingly composed from over 100 people's ideas and perspectives. A work of its caliber wouldn't have been possible with one person alone. For all the controversy that surrounds it, the Highwind scene is a shining example of how FF7 staff accommodated each other's visions to craft moving and memorable scenes.